Blood Like Dew, Ecosemiotics and Interpretation in the Confessions of Nat Turner. In his 1996 introduction to the Confessions of Nat Turner and Related Documents, Kenneth S. Greenberg makes a claim that has since received little attention. From his early childhood until his execution by the state of Virginia, Greenberg writes, Turner had found in his life and in the natural world a series of signs to be interpreted. Nat Turner was a semiotic rebel, a man moved to action by reading and interpreting the signs of heaven and earth. Greenberg drops this line of inquiry a few sentences later, and the word semiotic never reappears in his introduction. While readings of the Confessions have been far from homogeneous, a majority have focused on recuperating Turner's authorial voice and mentality from a text co-produced by Thomas Ruffin Gray, the white Virginia lawyer who recorded and published the Confessions in the week between Turner's 1831 capture and execution. Yet, as Henry Louis Gates has argued of this confessed transcription, there is no Nat Turner to recover. In this paper, I adopt this impossibility as a signal that the conventional literary critical categories of voice and representation may not be adequate to limn the political and methodological significance of the Confessions. Accordingly, my reading shifts critical attention away from historiographic problems of attribution to focus on the astronomical and meteorological landscapes central to the Confessions, asking both how Turner's interpretation of these landscapes makes Turner a semiotic rebel, and what practices of reading such a rebel semiotics might engender. Attending to Turner's interface with these landscapes, the events which Gray refers to as the, quote, insurrection, transmute into Turner's, quote, great work, from something contrived per Gray in the isolated and overwrought mind of a fanatic to something which in Turner's reading is already inscribed in the world itself. As we will see, the difference between Gray's insurrection and Turner's great work represents not only the competing interests of the plantocracy and its enslaved population, but divergent visions of nature, ecology, and signification. Attending to this divergence, this paper reads the contested space of the Confessions, its repression of Turner's great work, to better understand the consequences of his rebel semiotics. Turner's status as either author of the insurrection or interpreter of the great work stifles or elaborates the complex dialectical relation between Earth systems and human history, the mediation of this relationship by human and non-human signs, and the possibility that such a relation might carry ethico-political imperatives for racial and environmental liberation. My presentation attempts the following. First, an elaboration of Turner's rebel semiotics, focusing on what sorts of signs he reads, how he reads them, and how these signs mean. Second, a study of the atmospheric phenomenon of condensation, an important trope in Afro-diasporic literatures more broadly, which figures prominently in Turner's reading of the plantation landscape. And third, a return to Turner and Gray's interpretive antagonism in light of Turner's rebel semiotics. Nat Turner is a semiotic rebel, both because he is moved to action by reading and interpreting the signs of heaven and earth, and because he offers a unique account of semiotics, one not sufficiently considered in Western ideas of what constitutes reading and writing. His actions are semiotically motivated at the same time that they reconfigure our understanding of semiotics as such. Semiotics in literary and historical scholarship has often drawn on the work of Swiss linguist Ferdinand de Saussure. Saussure takes the arbitrary nature of the sign to be its most fundamental characteristic. The meaning of a sign, in other words, is purely symbolic, unmotivated by anything aside from social convention. The arbitrary nature of the sign dissolves any meaningful relation between sign and signified, and implicitly between word and world. Turner's reading subverts the supposedly elemental non-relation. The astronomical and meteorological signs that he reads exist outside the realm of language in the conventional sense, and seem to have a fundamental relation to the landscapes from which they emerge. In contrast to the Saussurean account, Turner provides a material semiotics in which phenomena such as thunder, lightning, and dew can be read and interpreted. Interpretation of these signs is neither purely idiosyncratic nor entirely based on social convention. The plantation landscape itself seems to be semiotically active, and Turner reads these signs by incorporating scientific knowledge, a faith-based worldview, and his own experience as an enslaved person. Turner's account of signification changes not only what a sign can be, but how a sign can mean. Turner's testimony in the Confessions can be read as an account of his interfacing with these signs. Interestingly, the testimony begins with an autobiographical account of Turner's childhood. He relates a moment when, being at play with other children, when 3 or 4 years old, I was telling them something, which my mother overhearing, said it had happened before I was born. The Lord had shown me things that had happened before my birth. Though Turner's parents had always suspected his greatness as a result of certain marks on his head and breast, something which John McKilgore has linked to African contraculture and which is itself an interpretation of material signs, this moment served to confirm his identification as a prophet in his community. This moment also serves to implicate Turner in a continuum beginning before his own consciousness, breaking open the conventional bounds of the subject and setting the stage for his great work as something deriving from more than just his own designs. Turner's testimony quickly turns from his status as a prophet to his early abilities as a reader and his curiosity in the world around him. Turner begins to read in a way similar to his earlier knowledge of events predating his birth, that is to say, without any teaching. We're told that Turner learned to read with such ease that he had no recollection whatsoever of learning the alphabet. By severing his experience as a reader from learning the alphabet, Turner hints at reading as a skill that is linked less to a specific language or syntax and more to his status as a prophet and his capacious mode of attending to the world around him. As he says, "There was nothing I saw or heard of to which my mind was not directed." By the time Turner begins to receive and interpret material signs, meteorological and astronomical phenomena like solar events, rolling thunder, hieroglyphic figures on leaves and in the sky, these early descriptions of Turner's reading practice have already clarified his interpretive insight as something other than a two-way radio with God. As we will see, Turner's understanding of earthly and heavenly signs was not accessible only to him. A crucial characterization of Turner's reading practice takes place when Gray proceeded to make some inquiries related to a recent insurrection in North Carolina. Gray asks Turner whether he had communicated his plans more broadly, and whether he knew of any extensive or concerted plan. Turner denies any knowledge of the events in North Carolina. But being pressed by Gray, he reverses the line of inquiry, asking, "Can you not think that the same ideas and strange appearances about this time in the heavens might prompt others as well as myself to this undertaking?" As Zach Marshall observes in his essay, Signs in the Heavens and the Distress of Nations, this moment extends Turner's inspiration beyond the scope of the idiosyncratic prophet. The signs informing Turner's reading are revealed to be broadly communicative, features of a prevailing worldly condition rather than private visions. The phenomena which Turner interprets are not only signs for him, but rather have signifying properties that can be interpreted by others, especially, it seems, by other enslaved persons. With this question, Marshall writes, Turner displaces the limited authority of his own voice in favor of the greater authority of an external signifier, where external signifier can be read to refer to the semiotic activity of the plantation landscape. Despite his self-description as a prophet, Turner emphasizes his role as a conduit rather than source of the great work of liberation. This decentering of the subject as the agential locus of semiosis is common to Turner's rebel semiotics and contemporary accounts of ecosemiotics, a field studying the internal mediation of ecosystems by sign processes, especially those descending from the work of Charles S. Peirce. As Matthew Clements observes, the role of the subject for Peirce seems largely contingent, the product of an ongoing process of semiosis rather than the proponent. Peirce's theory of signs adds a third term to Saussure's dualistic model of signifier and signified. Whereas Saussurean semiotics polarize the mental aspects of signs and the physical objects to which they refer, Peircean semiotics describe object, sign, and interpretant as existing in a constitutive, mediative relationship. The sign, no longer an internal function of the linguistic subject, becomes a truly middle term, able to describe meaning as deriving from both conventional and material relationships. This mediative status is held in common between Peirce and Turner, where Turner's ability to read the signs he encounters is seemingly dependent on his knowledge of Earth systems and the plantation landscape, that is to say, on material relations between sign and object. Indeed, a crucial turning point for Turner's great work took place when the Spirit revealed to him the knowledge of the elements, the revolution of the planets, the operations of tides, and changes of seasons. This revelation better equips Turner to develop and implement a semiotic system which allows him to read signs generated by the landscape, suggesting that their meaning derives in part from their material reality. Turner goes on to make a causal connection between this revelation and a renewed sense of purpose. After this revelation in the year 1825 and the knowledge of the elements being made known to me, I sought more than ever to obtain true holiness before the great day of judgment should appear. Knowledge of the elements prefigures the events which Gray would refer to as the insurrection, enabling and catalyzing Turner's preparation to attack the plantation class. Importantly, this disrupts the idea that scientific knowledge would demystify Turner's sign system. Before a solar eclipse on February 12, 1831, a sign which Turner cites as removing the seal from his lips to communicate his great work, a local newspaper reminded its readers that an eclipse was merely caused by the regular operation of natural laws. In his 2015 study of the Turner Revolt, Patrick Breen comments that, despite this newspaper's assurances to the contrary, one suspects that many Americans saw eclipses as meaningful. But what assurances is Breen referring to? The newspaper itself makes no explicit mention of meaning. Rather, both the newspaper and Breen take natural phenomena to be incommensurable with meaning. Mentioning one is enough to exclude the other. By contrast, Turner's rebel semiotics suggests that the regulation of phenomena by natural laws is precisely one way in which their meaning emerges. Acknowledging Turner's rebel semiotics changes the way we read the Confessions, redirecting critical attention away from Turner as normative linguistic subject and towards the semiotic activity of the landscape. Without creating any hierarchy of signs in the Confessions, it is worth noting that the matter of seeing and reading an eclipse is always already a matter of weather. Weather events like the formation of clouds, the rumbling of thunder, or the appearance of dew all feature in Turner's reading of the natural world and all share in the process of condensation. In the previous section, we saw that Turner's rebel semiotics determines meteorological phenomena to have meaning outside social and linguistic convention. In this section, I argue that understanding the role of condensation in the Confessions is necessary to understanding how Turner derives meaning from the signs he reads, especially how such signs are related to material histories of injustice in the plantation context. Condensation functions in the Confessions as both a particular material sign and a model for the emergence of meaning itself. Turner first notices the phenomenon of condensation when he attempts to produce meaning from signs in the sky. I looked and saw the forms of men in different attitudes, and there were lights in the sky. And I wondered greatly at these miracles, and prayed to be informed of a certainty of the meaning thereof. And shortly afterwards, while laboring in the field, I discovered drops of blood on the corn as though it were dew from heaven. Dew is created when atmospheric vapors settle around a cooling surface and begin to condense faster than they can evaporate. This transition from vapor to dew is a change in energy rather than substance. A higher energy gas state transitions to a lower energy liquid state. That Turner casts the blood he discovers as dew posits an atmosphere saturated with violence. The character of this violence is inflected by Turner's discovery of the dew while laboring in the field. The condensation of blood on corn echoes the transmutation of Black Death into capital. The violence perpetrated daily on the plantation likely renders this image, blood in the field, a relatively mundane one. Figured as dew, however, this blood acquires synecdochal status. It flips the terrible mundanity of the image into its unspeakable ubiquity. Dew is not the trace of a singular event. It signifies as condensate an utter permeation of violence. What condenses as dew is also that through which we move, that which characterizes our breath. Dew emerges as a sign, a condensation of this atmosphere, allowing it to be read and interpreted, signaling the material histories encoded therein. Quickly after discovering these drops of blood in the field and communicating his findings to those around him, Turner happens upon a series of related signs in the woods. And then I found on the leaves hieroglyphic characters and numbers with the forms of men in different attitudes, portrayed in blood and representing the figures I had seen before in the heavens. And now the Holy Ghost had revealed itself to me and made plain the miracles it had shown me. For as the blood of Christ had been shed on this earth and has ascended to heaven for the salvation of sinners, and was now returning to earth in the form of dew, and as the leaves on the trees bore the impression of the figures I had seen in the heavens, it was plain to me that the Savior was about to lay down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, and that the great day of judgment was at hand. Importantly, Turner's analogy, blood like dew, becomes literal in this passage. The figures which Turner had seen before in the heavens are made plain by their appearance in the form of blood, which, having indexed the character of the plantation atmosphere, now inflects the signs which Turner recognizes on the leaves. The clarifying coincidence of these signs mimics the mechanism of condensation itself, indexing the otherwise distributed and generalized semiotic field of the atmosphere. Turner's description of the movement of the blood of Christ seems almost to mimic the functioning of the hydrologic cycle. The shedding of Christ's blood on earth, its ascension to heaven, and its return as dew recall the processes of runoff, evapotranspiration, and precipitation. I'm not necessarily suggesting that Turner was familiar with these processes, though, as Christopher Duffy notes, contemporary understandings of the hydrologic cycle were already solidifying by the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but rather that, like the hydrologic cycle, Turner's interpretation of blood condensing like dew points us to a systems-level entanglement of historical and ecological forces. The integration of Christian teleology with geophysical systems is especially interesting. Turner's discovery of blood condensing like dew indexes both the plantation atmosphere and the blood of Christ. When Turner observes that the Savior was about to lay down the yoke he had borne for the sins of men, he indicates a tipping point of saturation similar to the literal condensation of dew. The great day of judgment and Turner's great work with it result from an atmosphere oversaturated with the sins of the plantation. The condition of the plantation seems to intervene on the second coming. The literal blood inundating the atmosphere condenses with the blood of Christ, which seems, in Turner's reading, to have ascended to a space which is both heaven and the heavens, that is, a redemptive milieu which is nevertheless influenced by meteorological forces. The plantation renders the heavens supersaturated with blood. Christ's sacrifice is no longer enough, and some new ethics, some great work is needed. Gray's commentary on the text constitutes a rereading of Turner's testimony. Presented in advance of the Confessions, the foreword serves to neutralize Turner's rebel semiotics, while Gray presents his motivation as a gratification of public curiosity. It is clear that his intervention on the Confessions has political bearing in the form of what Eric Sunkist has described as counter-subversive containment. By creating an unmistakable focal point, an authoritative report, Gray assumes control over any narratives generating outside the context of the state legal apparatus. This explanatory gravity is consistently renewed throughout the body of the Confessions in the form of clarifying interruptions. For example, when Turner relates his bodily markings and subsequent identification as a prophet by his parents, Gray cuts in a parcel of excrescences, which I believe are not at all uncommon, particularly among Negroes, as I have seen several with the same. Later, after Turner explains his discovery of blood condensing like dew and its implications, Gray interrupts again and asks, "Do you not find yourself mistaken now?" These interruptions do not provide any real clarity so much as they engage in an erasure of Turner's rebel semiotics. Importantly, Gray's explanation of Turner's bodily markings stifles both a reading of material signs and the relations of this reading to African contraculture. The explanatory gravity Gray attributes to the Confessions fail to attenuate Turner's interpretive system. To this end, Gray creates a symbolic gravity around Turner as leader. This is achieved through a repetitive construction of Turner as contriver and head of the insurrection. The Confessions, Gray writes, will read as a useful lesson as to the operations of a mind like his, endeavoring to grapple with things beyond its reach. Here, Turner's great work is figured as a misreading generating from a distinct and isolated source. Gray's phrasing also betrays a certain acknowledgement, or at least presence, of the atmospheric. The description, beyond its reach, gestures not only to a disparaging evaluation of Turner's mental capacity, but to his literal boundedness. More important than a dismissal of Turner's intellect is the figuration of the mind as an isolated creative space. Turner's interpretive mode is dismissed as a figment of a local and individual mind. The attribution of a symbolic gravity to Turner's head dredges meaning from outside the self and relocates it as fanaticism or sickness. Gray participates in a rhetorical severing of Turner's head from his body. The sentence, "how it first became bewildered and confounded and finally corrupted and led to the conception and perpetration of the most atrocious deeds," takes Turner's mind as its disembodied subject. Despite its absent worldly context, Gray attributes a total agency to Turner's mind, figuring it as both source and actor. Further isolating the head, Gray attributes an almost mythic intelligence to Turner, ironic in light of his earlier disparagement. For natural intelligence and quickness of apprehension, Turner is surpassed by few men I have ever seen. And then again, he possesses an uncommon share of intelligence with a mind capable of attaining anything, but warped and perverted by the influence of early impressions. This focus on Turner's ability as contriver and head aids in the continued localization of the insurrection. The attribution of such an uncanny intelligence becomes yet another condition of Turner's great work. Not only did Turner's actions not stem from a reading of material signs in the plantation environment, generating instead from his mind, they could only have stemmed from a head such as his. Gray's mythologizing rhetoric serves to sediment Turner's head as a symbol of the insurrection. The neutralization of Turner's rebel semiotics allows for a vision of the plantation in equilibrium. That is to say, where Turner's semiotics understands the air as saturated with blood, Gray's reading denies this history of violence as materially indexed in the space of the plantation. Whether consciously or implicitly, Gray severs the link between sign and world, thereby attenuating Turner's semiotic system. Where Turner figures his great work as indicated by a series of natural signs, Gray figures the insurrection as inscribed only in Turner's mind. In this sense, Gray reads Turner's visions as linked to the insurrection only by virtue of his own fanaticism. Plantation society is redeemed from the condemnation inherent in Turner's rebel semiotics. Its atmosphere is emptied of any histories of injustice. It will thus appear, Gray writes, that whilst everything upon the surface of society wore a calm and peaceful aspect, a gloomy fanatic was revolving in the recesses of his own dark, bewildered, and overwrought mind. In the aftermath of Turner's great work, it is the restoration of this calm and peaceful aspect, a gentle resolution of the problem of the plantation, which motivates Gray's reading, like a clearing of the skies. Thank you.